Elvis Presley was not someone who canceled shows. Through most of his career, he showed up. He performed when he was sick, when he was exhausted, and when he was going through things in his personal life that most people never heard about. His commitment to his audience was something he took seriously, and the people around him knew it. So when the news spread one night that Elvis would not be taking the stage, it caught everyone off guard. The venue was full. Fans had traveled from different cities, some from out of state, to be there. For many of them, this was not just a concert. Seeing Elvis live was something they had planned for weeks, in some cases months. They had their tickets, they had their seats, and they were waiting for the moment the lights would go down and the music would start. The atmosphere inside the building was the kind that only Elvis could create, a mix of excitement and anticipation that filled every corner of the room. Then the announcement came. The exact wording varied depending on who was relaying the message, but the meaning was the same. Elvis would not perform that night. The show was not going to happen, people were asked to leave in an orderly manner, and there would be information about refunds available through the box office. That was essentially all that was said. There was no detailed explanation, no public statement from Elvis himself, and no one from his management team came forward to give a full account of what had happened. The reaction inside the venue was a mixture of confusion and disappointment. Some fans stood in place for a while, not quite believing what they had just heard. Others moved toward the exits quietly, still holding their programs. A few were visibly upset. For most of them, this was simply something that did not happen with Elvis. He was known for his live performances. Even in the later years of his career, when his health had become a concern and the pressures of his schedule were well documented, he still got on stage. He still delivered. The idea that he would simply not appear was something people were not prepared for. Outside the venue, the scene was similar. People gathered in small groups, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Word spread quickly among those who had been waiting outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of Elvis arriving or leaving. The questions were straightforward, but nobody had real answers. Was he sick? Had something happened? Was it serious? The people working the event did not have much to say, either because they genuinely did not know or because they had been told to keep quiet. The official explanation that came out in the hours and days that followed was vague. The word most commonly used was illness. Elvis was not feeling well enough to perform, and the decision had been made to cancel the show out of concern for his health. That explanation was accepted by most people on the surface, because it was the simplest one available. Artists get sick, shows get canceled. It happens. But for those who were close to the situation, the explanation did not fully add up. People who had been around Elvis during that period knew that illness alone rarely stopped him. He had performed through physical problems before. He had walked out on stage on nights when, by any reasonable measure, he probably should have been resting. The fact that this night was different, that someone had made the call to keep him off the stage entirely, suggested that whatever was happening was more serious than a general statement about his health was letting on. The press covered the cancellation briefly. It was noted, reported, and then largely moved past, the way many events in Elvis's life were treated during that era. The public's attention moved on, but among the small group of people who had actually been with Elvis that night, in the hours before the show was supposed to begin, there was a shared understanding that what had happened was not something that could be explained in a single sentence. The real story was something they kept between themselves, at least for a while. The Elvis that most people saw was the one on stage or on screen. He was polished, he was confident, and he carried himself in a way that made everything look effortless. That was the image, and it was a powerful one. But the Elvis who existed away from the cameras and the concert halls was a different person in many ways. Someone dealing with a set of problems that had been building for years and that most of the public had very little awareness of. By the time the mid-1970s arrived, Elvis's private life had become genuinely difficult. His marriage to Priscilla had ended in divorce in 1973, and while he maintained a civil relationship with her for the sake of their daughter Elisa Marie, the end of that marriage affected him more than he showed publicly. He had built a significant part of his personal identity around being a husband and a father in a traditional sense, and when that structure fell apart, it left a gap that he struggled to fill. He spent more time at Graceland, more time surrounded by the group of friends and employees who made up his inner circle, and less time in situations where he was genuinely alone with his thoughts. His health during this period was a subject that those around him were aware of, but rarely discussed openly. Elvis had been dealing with a number of physical conditions for several years. He had a liver condition, issues with his colon, and a condition called achalasia, which made swallowing difficult and affected how his body processed food. He also had glaucoma, which had been affecting his vision for some time. These were not minor inconveniences. They were ongoing medical problems that required attention and that took a real toll on his body over time. On top of the physical issues, there was the matter of the medications he was taking. Dr. George Nicolopoulos, who served as Elvis's personal physician, had been prescribing a range of medications to help him manage pain, sleep, anxiety, and other conditions. The volume of those prescriptions had grown over time, and by the mid-1970s, Elvis was taking a significant number of different medications on a regular basis. The people closest to him could see the effects. There were days when he was sharp, engaged, and energetic. There were other days when he was slow, unfocused, and clearly not well. The variation was noticeable, and it created an unpredictability in his daily life that made planning difficult for everyone around him. His health had also become a visible concern. Elvis had always been careful about his appearance earlier in his career, but in the 1970s that changed. His diet was not healthy, his activity levels had dropped, and the combination of medication side effects and a difficult daily routine had contributed to significant weight gain. He was aware of it. He talked about it with people he trusted, and it bothered him in a way that went beyond simple vanity. For someone whose entire professional identity was tied to how he looked and how he moved on stage, the physical changes he was going through carried an emotional weight as well. The structure of his daily life also contributed to his difficulties. Elvis rarely kept normal hours. He slept during the day and was often awake through the night. Graceland operated on his schedule, and the people who worked for him adjusted their lives accordingly. This kind of isolation from ordinary daily rhythms made it harder for him to stay connected to the world outside. He watched television, he read, he spent time with Lisa Marie when she visited, and he spent long stretches of time in the company of the same small group of people who had been around him for years. Those people, the ones who made up what was commonly called the Memphis Mafia, genuinely cared about Elvis in most cases, but they were also in a complicated position. Their livelihoods were connected to him. Challenging him directly or raising serious concerns about his health and habits was not always easy in that environment. So a great deal went unaddressed, and Elvis continued moving through his days carrying a weight that was heavier than most people on the outside ever realized. The hours before a scheduled Elvis performance followed a fairly consistent pattern. There were people moving through the backstage area, equipment being checked, security managing access, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Elvis preparing himself for the show. He had a routine, and the people around him knew their roles within it. On most nights, despite whatever was happening in his personal life or with his health, that routine held together well enough to get him to the stage. On this particular night, it did not. The problems began earlier in the day, well before the scheduled start time of the show. Elvis had not slept well, which on its own was not unusual. Disrupted sleep was a regular part of his life by this point, and it was something he and the people around him had learned to work around. But on this day, the lack of rest combined with other factors in a way that made the situation more serious than a typical difficult morning. By the time the afternoon arrived, it was already clear to the people closest to him that something was wrong. His physical condition that day was concerning. He was not moving well, and those who saw him in the hours leading up to the show described him as being in visible discomfort. The medications he took regularly were part of his daily management of ongoing health problems, but the balance of those medications was something that shifted depending on how he was doing on any given day. On this particular day, that balance was off. He was not alert in the way he needed to be, and there were moments where he was difficult to reach, not unconscious, but not fully present either. The people who were with him that day faced the situation they had navigated in various forms before, but rarely to this degree. There was a show scheduled. There were thousands of people expecting to see Elvis perform, and there was a man in front of them who was in no condition to walk out on a stage. The tension in that situation was real. Canceling a show carried consequences, financial, professional, and reputational. But putting Elvis in front of an audience in the state he was in carried consequences of a completely different kind. The decision did not come easily, and it was not made by one person alone. The small group of individuals who were present that evening talked through what they were seeing and what the options were. Some of them had been with Elvis for many years and had seen him push through difficult nights before. They knew what he looked like when he was tired but manageable, and they knew what they were looking at now was different. This was not something that a strong cup of coffee and an hour of preparation was going to fix. This was a man who needed rest and medical attention, not a stage and a spotlight. When the call was finally made to cancel the show, the process of informing the relevant people began. The venue staff were told, the promoters were contacted, and the public announcement was arranged. Through all of that, the explanation given was kept deliberately simple. Elvis was ill and could not perform. That much was true, but the specifics of what kind of illness, what had actually been happening in the hours before, and what the people backstage had witnessed, none of that was shared with anyone outside the immediate circle. Elvis himself was aware that the show had been canceled. He was not unconscious or completely out of reach, but he was also not in a position to make decisions or direct what was happening around him. The people with him that night made the calls that needed to be made, and they did so with the understanding that what they had seen would stay among themselves. By the time the venue was clearing out and the crowd was making its way home, the situation backstage had stabilized. Elvis was being looked after and the immediate crisis had passed. But the night had made something very clear to the people who had been there. The path Elvis was on was not sustainable, and what had happened was not an isolated incident. It was a sign of something larger that was continuing to develop, whether anyone wanted to acknowledge it openly or not. When something significant happened in Elvis's private life, the circle of people who actually knew the full story was always small. He was surrounded by a large group of associates, employees, and longtime friends, but genuine trust was reserved to very few. On the night the show was canceled, the people who were present for the worst of it and who understood exactly what had taken place could be counted on one hand. 3 of them, in particular, carried the complete picture of what that night looked like, and they made a quiet agreement, without it needing to be spelled out, that the details would not leave the room. The first of these individuals was someone from Elvis's inner circle who had been with him for years. This was not a new relationship or someone who had come into his life recently. This was a person who had traveled with him, worked alongside him through multiple periods of his career, and had seen Elvis at his best and at his worst. That kind of history created a loyalty that went beyond the professional arrangement. When you have been with someone through the full range of what their life contains, protecting them in a difficult moment does not feel like a choice so much as an instinct. This person understood what the public image of Elvis meant, not just to Elvis himself, but to the people who loved him, and they were not willing to be the one who damaged it. The second person was someone with a more formal role in managing Elvis's well-being that night. This individual had a practical responsibility for what happened to Elvis physically, and their presence that evening was directly connected to the medical nature of what was unfolding. They had seen the condition Elvis was in, they had been involved in the decisions made about his care, and they understood better than most what the underlying causes of the situation were. For this person, silence was partly professional. There are boundaries around what you share when you are entrusted with someone's personal health, and those boundaries felt especially firm when the person in question was Elvis Presley. Speaking openly about what had happened would have meant exposing details that went well beyond a single canceled concert. The third person was someone emotionally close to Elvis in a personal sense. This was not purely a professional relationship. This individual cared about Elvis on a level that had nothing to do with career or employment, and being present for a night like that one was painful in a way that the others may not have experienced in quite the same way. Watching someone you care about in a state of genuine crisis and then having to compose yourself enough to help manage the situation around it is not something that leaves you quickly. For this person, the silence that followed was not just about protecting Elvis's reputation. It was also about processing something that was difficult to put into words, and perhaps not wanting to relive it by talking about it with people who had not been there. What these three people shared, beyond the specific details of that night, was an understanding of the larger situation Elvis was living in. They were not naive about his health or about the direction things were heading. They had seen enough over the months and years leading up to that night to know that the problems were real and that they were serious. But they also existed within a world where speaking up about those problems was complicated. Elvis's operation, the tours, the recordings, the business around him, involved a great many people whose livelihoods depended on things continuing to move forward. Raising alarms in a direct and public way was not something the structure around Elvis made easy. So they kept what they knew to themselves. In the days after the cancellation, when people asked questions and the press looked for information, the three of them said nothing that went beyond the simple explanation that had already been given to the public. They returned to their roles, Elvis recovered enough to continue, and the night was folded into the larger story of his final years without ever being fully examined. It would be a long time before any part of what they witnessed began to surface, and even then, it came out slowly, in fragments, through interviews and recollections that emerged only after Elvis was gone. For a period of time after that night, the cancellation remained exactly what it had been presented as, a brief entry in the record of Elvis's later career, explained away as illness and largely forgotten by the general public. The people who had been there said nothing beyond what had already been made public, and without their accounts, there was no story to tell. Elvis continued performing, continued touring, and the machinery around him kept moving forward in the way it always had. The night existed in the background, unexamined. Then Elvis died on August 16, 1977. His death changed everything about how people looked at the final years of his life. What had previously been treated as private matters or manageable concerns suddenly became subjects of serious public interest. Journalists, biographers, and former members of his inner circle began looking more carefully at the period leading up to his death, trying to understand what had actually been happening behind the scenes. The questions that had not been asked loudly enough while he was alive were now being asked with a great deal of urgency, and the people who had been closest to him were being approached for answers. The first accounts to emerge were cautious. People who had worked with Elvis or been part of his circle gave interviews that acknowledged general difficulties without going into specific detail. There was talk of health problems, of a demanding schedule, of personal struggles. These early accounts confirmed that things had not been straightforward in Elvis's final years, but they stopped well short of a complete picture. The people speaking were still navigating their own feelings about Elvis, their loyalty to his memory, and in some cases, their concern about how they themselves would be perceived if the full story came out. Over time, that began to change. Books started appearing. Red West and Sonny West, two longtime members of Elvis's inner circle who had been let go shortly before his death, published a book in 1977 that caused significant controversy because it addressed Elvis's drug dependency directly. It was one of the first times that people who had genuinely been inside his world spoke in public about the medication problem in concrete terms. The book was criticized by some who felt it was poorly timed and disrespectful, but it also opened the door that could not easily be closed again. Once the conversation had started, others felt more able to contribute to it. Dr. George Nicopolis, Elvis's personal physician, became a central figure in the longer unfolding of this story. His prescribing practices came under legal scrutiny in the years following Elvis's death, and the proceedings that followed brought a significant amount of detail into public view. The volume of medications that had been prescribed, the range of substances involved, and the frequency with which they had been provided were documented in ways that gave the public a clearer picture of what Elvis's medical situation had actually looked like. Nicopolis maintained that he had been trying to manage Elvis's genuine medical needs and reduce his dependency over time. But the records that came out told a complicated story that people interpreted in different ways. Ginger Alden, who had been Elvis's girlfriend in the final months of his life and was the person who found him on the day he died, also shared her perspective in the years that followed. Her accounts added a personal dimension to the picture of Elvis's final period, what he was like in private, how he was feeling, what he talked about. These were not clinical or professional observations, but the recollections of someone who had been close to him in an intimate way, and they filled in parts of the story that the more formal account had not addressed. Gradually, through all of these sources, the specific night of the canceled show began to be understood in a fuller context. It was no longer an isolated incident that had been adequately explained by a vague reference to illness. It was one moment in a longer pattern that people were now able to trace with more clarity. The details that the three people in that room had kept to themselves for so long were not all spoken aloud even then, but enough had come out through other channels that the shape of what had happened was becoming visible. The story had taken years to surface, and it had come out in pieces rather than all at once. But by the time those pieces were assembled, the picture they formed was an honest one. One canceled show in the middle of a career that spanned more than 2 decades might seem like a small thing when you look at the full picture of what Elvis Presley accomplished. He recorded hundreds of songs, made 33 films, performed thousands of concerts, and became one of the most recognized figures in the history of popular music. A single night where he did not take the stage could easily be lost in the volume of everything else. But that night is worth examining closely, not because of what it says about his career, but because of what it says about the person behind it. Elvis lived under a level of pressure that very few people have ever experienced. From the moment he became famous in the mid-1950s, the expectations placed on him were enormous, and they never really let up. He was expected to perform, to record, to appear, to be available, and to meet a standard that had been set so high that maintaining it over decades was simply not a realistic thing to ask of any human being. The people around him, the industry he operated in, and in some ways the public itself all contributed to a situation where his needs as a person were consistently placed below the demands of his role as an entertainer. What happened on the night of that canceled show was a direct result of that pressure. It was not a random event or simply bad luck. It was the outcome of years of physical strain, emotional difficulty, inadequate medical care in some respects, and a support structure that was not always equipped to prioritize his long-term health over his short-term obligations. The people who made the decision to cancel that night did the right thing in that moment, but the conditions that had led to that moment had been developing for a long time, and a single canceled show did not change them. Elvis himself was not a passive figure in all of this. He made choices, and some of those choices contributed to his difficulties. But it is also important to understand the environment those choices were made in. He had very little experience of ordinary life. He had been famous since he was a young man, and the structures of normal daily existence, the kind that most people rely on to stay grounded, were largely absent from his world. He was surrounded by people whose role was to accommodate him rather than challenge him, and the isolation that came with that kind of life made it genuinely difficult for him to see his situation clearly or to ask for the kind of help that might have made a difference. The three people who were in that room on the night of the cancellation understood this better than most. They had seen enough of his private life to know that what the public saw was only part of the picture. Their decision to stay silent about what had happened was made out of loyalty and protectiveness, and on a human level, it is not difficult to understand why they made it. But their silence also meant that the people who might have been able to intervene more effectively did not have the full information they needed. That is one of the quiet costs of the culture of secrecy that surrounded Elvis in his final years. What this night ultimately reveals is the distance that existed between the image of Elvis and the reality of his life. The image was of someone invincible, larger than life, capable of walking out on any stage at any moment and commanding a room. The reality was of a man who was physically unwell, emotionally isolated, and carrying a weight that had become too heavy to manage alone. Both of these things were true at the same time, and that is what makes his story genuinely complicated rather than simply sad. He was not just a symbol or a cultural figure. He was a person with the same need for care, honesty, and support that any person has. The night he did not perform is a reminder of that. It is a reminder that behind everything he gave to the world, there was a human being who needed things that the world around him was not always able to give back. That is the part of the story that stays with you.